Welcome to Libeth. Before you can understand the unfettered mind, you need to understand the world it came out of. Not as background, as a system under pressure. A system that had just violently reorganized itself and was already discovering that the reorganization had not resolved the contradictions that caused the violence. It had relocated them, renamed them, and dressed them in the language of cosmic order. Japan in 1632 was not a country at peace in any deep structural sense. It was a country whose capacity for war had been successfully contained, but whose social logic had not changed enough to absorb the containment without cost. The tension simply moved inward. And the unfettered mind is, among other things, a document produced by that tension, a text that takes the most fundamental question of the warrior tradition and redirects it from the battlefield into the interior of the mind, because the battlefield, formally speaking, had been closed. The Tokugawa victory at Sekigahara in 1600 was not simply a military event. It was the beginning of an administrative project whose ambition was total, and whose instrument was the management of legitimacy itself. Tokugawa Ieyasu understood that military victory was necessary, but insufficient. You could win a battle and still lose the state if the mechanisms by which authority justified itself were not aligned. So what the Tokugawa constructed over the first 2 decades of the 17th century was a system of legitimation that operated on multiple registers simultaneously. And that multiplicity was both the system's strength and the source of its internal stress. Authority was legitimized through hereditary claim, through Confucian philosophical framing, through Buddhist institutional sanction, and through the brute incontestable fact of superior force. Each of these pillars reinforced the others, and together they produced a regime that felt less like a political arrangement than an expression of natural and cosmic order. That was the intention. But each pillar also contained its own internal logic, and those logics were not always compatible. The Confucian framework demanded virtue as the condition of legitimate rule. The hereditary claim demanded lineage regardless of virtue. The Buddhist framework operated according to a spiritual hierarchy that the secular one could not fully absorb. And force, while it could compel obedience, could not by itself produce the consent that made governance something other than permanent occupation. A system that legitimizes itself through 4 different registers simultaneously has to manage the gaps between them constantly, and it is in those gaps that political tension accumulates. The formal administrative structure appeared seamless from a distance. The shogun held executive authority, advised by senior counselors called Raju who managed central policy. Below them, approximately 260 domain lords, the daimyo, governed semi-autonomous territories called Han, each with its own administrative apparatus, its own samurai retainers, its own relationship to the agricultural surplus that was the foundation of all economic and political power. The daimyo were not simply subjects. They were vassal lords with real armies, real wealth, and real local authority. They were also, from the shogunate's perspective, the single greatest structural threat to the stability of the regime, because the memory of Sekigahara was not old enough to have become myth, and among the daimyo were men whose families had stood on the losing side of that battle and had not forgotten which side that was. The Tazama lords, the outside lords, former enemies incorporated into the system through defeat, held domains deliberately placed at geographical distance from Edo, deliberately excluded from the senior administrative positions that would give them proximity to the center, deliberately constrained in their capacity to accumulate the resources that rebellion would require. The feudai lords, the loyal families, the hereditary allies held the inner ring, the positions of trust, the access. The geography of the country was itself a map of political anxiety. The instrument the shogunate used to manage this anxiety was the sankin-kotai system, the requirement that daimyo divide their time between their domains and Edo, rotating on a roughly annual schedule, with their families remaining in the capital when they were absent from it. This system is usually described as a mechanism for preventing rebellion, and that is accurate, but it is worth being precise about the mechanisms involved. The families in Edo were hostages in everything but name. Their presence at the capital ensured that any daimyo contemplating defection understood exactly what the cost would be in personal terms. But the system's financial dimension was equally important and less often emphasized. Maintaining two full establishments, a residence in the domain and a residence in Edo, each requiring staff, ceremony, upkeep, and the display of status appropriate to a lord of the relevant rank, was extraordinarily expensive. The sankin-kotai system was, among its other functions, an economic drain deliberately engineered into the structure of daimyo obligation. Lords who were spending their surplus on travel and dual residences were lords who could not easily accumulate the capital that military mobilization would require. The cage was built from the inside, and the bars were financial. What this produced at the level of the daimyo class was a kind of structural resentment that had no legitimate outlet. The daimyo had status, armies they were not permitted to use against rivals, wealth they were not permitted to accumulate beyond a certain threshold without attracting dangerous attention, and an obligation to perform loyalty to a system that had, in many cases, defeated and incorporated their families within living memory. The form of that resentment varied. Some daimyo channeled it into cultural production, into the patronage of arts and the cultivation of sophisticated aesthetic identities that asserted dignity in domains the shogunate could not easily regulate. Others channeled it into administration, becoming genuinely capable governors of their domains within the constraints the system permitted. But the resentment was structural, not personal, and it reproduced itself with each generation regardless of the individual temperament of the lord who held it. The system required the daimyo to want things they were not permitted to have, and then required them to perform contentment. The samurai class beneath the daimyo carried a different version of the same fundamental problem, and this version is the one most directly relevant to what Takwan is writing about. The samurai existed, in the early Edo period, as a military class without a military function. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is an identity crisis of extraordinary depth, because the samurai identity was not simply a social role or an economic position. It was a total self-definition organized around the capacity for violence in service of loyalty, around the willingness to kill and to die, which is not a skill but a condition of being, a way of inhabiting the world that touches everything. How you walk, how you speak, how you hold your body, how you relate to other people, how you understand your own death. For 150 years, that self-definition had immediate, concrete, daily content. The sword was a tool. The dojo was preparation for a situation that might arrive at any moment. The hierarchy of lords and retainers was a chain of obligation whose final link was the readiness to spend your life in combat. By 1620, by 1630, that chain had lost its final link. The sword was still worn, uniquely, exclusively, as the visible marker of samurai status, the physical sign that distinguished this class from all others. But it was increasingly a symbol, and the gap between what the symbol claimed, perpetual readiness for mortal combat, and what the daily life of most samurai actually involved, paperwork, ceremony, tax administration, the management of the domain's agricultural logistics, was a gap that the ideology of the period tried to paper over with Confucian arguments about the virtue of order and the martial class's role as its guardian. Those arguments were not entirely dishonest, but they were insufficient. They could not give back the thing that had actually been lost, which was the daily lived reality that made the identity feel real from the inside. The Confucian philosophical framework the Tokugawa institutionalized was, in its Japanese adaptation, a comprehensive account of social order as moral necessity. The hierarchy was not merely convenient. It was an expression of the natural order of things, in which each person occupied a role that was both their social position and their moral duty. Loyalty to one's lord was not submission, but virtue. Filial piety, the absolute obligation to the father, and by extension, to the lord who occupied the father's position in the social hierarchy, was the structural principle on which everything else depended. This was enormously useful ideologically, because it transformed compliance into righteousness and resistance into moral failure, not merely political incorrectness. But Confucianism also carried a threat that the Tokugawa had to manage carefully, because in the Chinese tradition from which it derived, the legitimacy of a ruler depended on virtue and not merely on hereditary claim. A government that failed its people had, in principle, forfeited its mandate from heaven. The Tokugawa could use Confucian language to justify their authority, but they could not fully embrace the philosophical framework without implicitly accepting the standard by which their authority could be judged and, in principle, revoked. Buddhism added a further layer of complexity, precisely because the Tokugawa had chosen to use it as an instrument of state administration. The temple registration system, Teryuk, assigned every family in Japan to a Buddhist temple, which then tracked births, deaths, marriages, and population movements, functioning as a census mechanism and a surveillance apparatus simultaneously. This gave the Buddhist establishment institutional reach throughout the entire country, from the major urban temples to the smallest rural communities. That reach was useful to the shogunate. It was also a source of structural anxiety, because any institution that penetrates society that deeply is an institution that could, under the right circumstances, become a center of alternative loyalty. The shogunate's response was to assert control over the appointment of senior clergy, to ensure that the leadership of the Buddhist establishment was politically reliable. And this assertion of control is exactly what produced the confrontation with Takuan in 1629. He protested openly when the shogunate attempted to impose a candidate for an important abbotship, framing the protest as a defense of the integrity of the religious lineage. He was exiled. The episode reveals the internal logic of the system with unusual clarity. The state requires the religious establishment as an administrative tool, but an administrative tool must be controlled, and control of the religious establishment requires precisely the kind of political interference that undermines the religious establishment's moral authority, which is the quality that made it useful in the first place. The formal social hierarchy, samurai at the top, then farmers, then artisans, then merchants, in descending order of Confucian prestige, was an ideological construction whose relationship to economic reality grew more strained with every passing decade. The logic behind the ranking was Confucian. The samurai governed and protected, which was the highest function. Farmers produced the rice that sustained everyone, which was the second function. Artisans made things, which was the third. And merchants merely moved things that others produced, which was parasitism dressed as service. Merchants deserved the lowest rank because they contributed nothing to the substance of society, while extracting value from everyone else's labor. This was the official position. The actual position of merchants in the economic life of early Edo Japan was almost the inverse. Osaka was becoming one of the most sophisticated commercial and financial centers in the world, with commodity futures markets, credit mechanisms, and capital accumulation operating at a scale that the rice stipend economy of the samurai class could not match. The samurai were paid in rice. Rice was not cash. Converting stipends into cash required engaging with a merchant economy that was developing its own internal logic, its own networks of obligation and trust, its own cultural prestige systems. And the samurai, whose formal status was unquestionable, found themselves increasingly dependent on the financial services of a class they officially despised. Debt ran upward through the hierarchy, from samurai retainers indebted to their domains, to domains increasingly indebted to the merchant houses of Osaka. The ideological ranking said merchants were at the bottom. The economy said merchants held the future. This divergence between formal rank and economic reality was structurally destabilizing in ways that unfolded over generations rather than seasons. But the trajectory was visible to careful observers even in the early Edo period. A class that holds formal authority while losing economic independence is a class whose authority is becoming increasingly symbolic. And symbols, unlike assets, cannot be easily defended when the gap between what they claim and what they represent becomes too visible. The samurai class was, in this sense, experiencing a slow version of the same displacement that the daimyo were experiencing at the political level. Formal power maintained, functional power gradually eroding, and no legitimate mechanism for addressing the erosion. The family, the ai, was the fundamental unit of social organization in this system, and it was organized around the logic of continuity rather than the logic of individuals. The ai was not simply a biological family. It included servants, apprentices, and adopted members. It was an economic unit, a social unit, and an institution that existed across time. That had a past, in the form of ancestors whose memory was maintained and whose obligations were inherited, and a future, in the form of heirs whose primary duty was to carry the family name and its associated obligations forward. Primogeniture organized inheritance. The eldest son took the household, the assets, the debts, and the duties. Other sons had to find their own paths, through adoption into households that needed heirs, through service as retainers to larger households, through the limited options available to people of their rank who were not the eldest. The ai was a machine for producing continuity, and continuity was the Tokugawa system's highest value, more important than innovation, more important than mobility, more important than the individual's capacity to act on their own judgment. The system was designed to minimize the unpredictable, and the individual human life, with its irreducible capacity for deviation, was its primary material. Scale outward from the household, and you reach the han, the domain as a macro family, the lord as symbolic patriarch, the retainers as children at various degrees of proximity to the center of the household. The loyalty that bound retainer to lord was understood through the same moral framework as filial piety, the same Confucian obligation structure that governed the relationship between son and father, now transposed to the political register. Always dependent on the system's continued capacity to deliver the material conditions that made the obligation bearable. The Yagyu clan occupied an unusual position in this network of obligations and dependencies. They were domain lords with territorial holdings in Yamato, a genuine Han with genuine samurai retainers and genuine administrative functions. And they were simultaneously the official sword instructors to the Tokugawa house, which gave them access to the shogun himself in a context of intimate, daily instruction that no other daimyo family had. This dual position was an extraordinary concentration of proximity to power, and it also meant that Munenori, who received Takuan's letters, was not a swordsman who happened to have political connections. He was a political actor whose martial function was itself a form of political performance. The shogun trained under his instruction, which meant that the shogun's identity as a warrior, the ideological foundation of the entire regime's claim to martial authority, was in part Munenori's production. A man in that position had unusual visibility into the nature of power, how it was constructed, how it was maintained, how it depended on the quality of the person at its center rather than merely on the institutional structures that surrounded them. Below the level of the domain, the village, the mura was organized on principles of collective liability that distributed social control into the smallest possible unit. Villages were self-governing in their internal arrangements, but collectively responsible for their tax obligations to the domain. If one household failed to pay, the entire village absorbed the deficit. This created powerful incentives for mutual surveillance and mutual discipline at the community level, which meant the state did not need to maintain a constant physical presence in every village in order to ensure compliance. The community had been organized to police itself. The Ganingumi system formalized this further by making groups of 5 neighboring households explicitly responsible for each other's conduct. Each household was legally implicated in the behavior of its 4 neighbors, which meant that deviance was everyone's problem, that the individual who considered stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior was not simply risking their own consequences, but imposing risk on the people around them. Social conformity was not merely a cultural preference in this system. It was built into the architecture of liability. The Buddhist temple at the center of each community was simultaneously a spiritual institution, a social anchor, and an administrative node. It registered you at birth and at death. It tracked your household. It provided the certification of religious affiliation that the Terayuk system required. It educated, in many cases, the children of the community. It housed the memory of the dead in a form that connected the living community to the obligations of lineage. The temple was where the private and the public intersected, where the interior life of the household, its births, its deaths, its religious observances, was made legible to the state machinery that used religious infrastructure as its most granular information system. Formal order maintained through multiple overlapping mechanisms of surveillance and mutual obligation, with no single center from which the whole derives coherent meaning, and with the tensions that exist at the top reproduced, in smaller scale and with different instruments, all the way to the household level. What you have, taken as a whole, is a system of extraordinary formal stability that is producing instability at every level of its construction simultaneously. Warriors without war. Merchants with wealth but no power. Daimyo with armies they cannot deploy. A religious establishment turned into a surveillance mechanism that thereby loses the moral authority that made it worth using. A Confucian ideology that legitimizes hierarchy while containing the philosophical resources for critiquing it. A family structure organized around continuity in a world where the economic base that continuity depends on is shifting beneath its feet. A community structure organized around collective liability in a world where the interests of the individual and the interests of the collective are increasingly difficult to align. And at the center of all of this, the question that the unfettered mind is actually addressing. What do you do with a trained capacity for decisive action in a world that has made decisive action structurally impossible? You turn the question inward. You redirect the demand for complete presence and total commitment from the battlefield to the interior of the mind itself. That is not a retreat from the warrior tradition. It is the warrior tradition arriving at its actual frontier. One new book every week. At least we try.